Welcome to Caveland. Caveland is an invention of our friend Philip Ken. A whole strand stories about moles, and you can see the moles in an hour in this other part of the theater here. But I'm in charge of a serious part, which is a lecture. And like every lectures in France, it has to have three parts. The first part is an exploration of why we are somewhat disoriented in space and time at the time of the ecological crisis. The second part is an attempt, very experimental attempt, at finding other way of visualizing alternative topography, so to speak, of our landing on Earth. And the third one is a conclusion, a more political one, if you want, on the consequences of this alternative representation. So I'm going to use in these lectures images which have been explored by Alexandra Arène and Sonia Levy, and really I'm really commenting on their work. So this is the collective work that we are presenting today in these lectures. But I want first to start with a small anecdote to give you a bit the spirit of this situation. I was in a plane. I'm sure you also are often in this situation. You are in a plane. You try to see the landscape. And this time, it was a year ago, I was above the land of Baffin, slightly west of Greenland. I was trying to watch the spectacle, which is always amazing, of the ice. But this time something unusual happened, because it seemed that the ice was actually sending me a message. And I took my pictures and very quickly took a pictures of that screaming images, as if the ice pack, which was disbanding very early last year, it's slightly better this year, was telling me something, and it looks a bit like the scream of Munch coming back to me. You know that before, in the old days, when we were watching a spectacle of nature, we were outside of it. And that's why the title of this lecture is about being inside. But now you are no longer outside, because it's impossible. We are actually inside, because my activity in this plane going to Canada was actually having an effect on the very spectacle of nature that I was seeing. And that's in that sense there is no outside anymore. This is the title of the lecture. We have now to go down, to accept to go down into the cave, hence the title of Caveland. The problem that it's difficult to be in the cave. We are not supposed to like to be inside in the cave where it's wet and dark. And one of the reasons, of course, is that we share this magnificent myth of Plato about the cave. The cave is what we escape if we are a philosopher, or if we even begin to think about something which is higher than to be a prisoner faced only with the image that are projected on the cave, just like people in a movie, or like yourself, actually. And this story, I'm sure you know it, I don't have to tell you again the story of philosophers escaping. The whole work of escaping is escaping outside. And that's the whole idea of the movement of a philosopher, breaking down with the cave and getting outside. But there are lots of problems with this beautiful story. It is a beautiful story. It has very great power, and it has sort of a religious, a scientific, a political power. But hopefully it's not exactly the real story. I've always thought that there was something bizarre in this very famous myth. It was very implausible that philosophers were asked to live outside. So I think the alternative view of that famous story is that the myth of a cave is actually a show. It's a show which is given by Plato to the Athenian. And that would be a much better way. We are all applauding the completely implausible show that Plato is giving us, imagining that the greatest thing in the world would be to get outside, and this strange story about the philosophers who come back and who is then killed because he's telling people that they should go outside. And the strange thing is that the people are not supposed to be prisoners. So what did the Athenians do? When they heard about this show, they applauded it as a very funny and totally implausible definition of what it is to do philosophy, science, or religion. In other words, it was more like the cloud of Aristophanes, not something very serious. And this is what has blinded us to the notion of being inside. One of the reasons why it is so difficult to accept the idea that we are actually inside on Earth is this very powerful myth of being outside. Now, if it's a show, well, it's a nice show. It's a very powerful story. And Peter Sloterdijk has done a whole work at showing why it's impossible to be outside in Sphären. So it is simultaneously a powerful show and a completely implausible definition of what it is to be and how we actually live on Earth. The problem that if we accept that we are never outside, we will never get outside, one of the most powerful images that we have, that is the blue planet, is not the one where we are. We are not on the blue planet. Even though I know it's a very famous icon, it is beautiful to see it inflated like a balloon and to imagine that we are there. But there are lots of things that don't work with these images. One of them is that it's very rare, actually, to get pictures of the whole Earth like that. There are very few of them, in spite of the ubiquity of this mythical image. The second thing is that it was supposed, I'm sure you have heard that many times, that once we have seen the blue planet together, we will all be united. That it was the beginning of a vast fraternity, so to speak. And people often use these gestures of the hands to say, well, look, we have to be on the same Earth, in the same nature, on the same blue planet. That should unite us. And this is obviously not what has happened. On the contrary, nature has been dividing us even more. So the blue planet, probably not a good metaphor. And also, obviously, the blue planet is viewed from outside, from very, very far outside, and it merged with lots of other globe, the Roman globe, the orbis terrarum, all sort of metaphors of the globe of power and the view of God. This is not the way it actually works. Because as Sloterdijk again has shown, the global is always locally situated. And if you now hear, you are going to hear the sound of the Apollo capsule inside which one of his famous images, which is the Earth rising, has been taken. And we are now the 24th of December, 1968. And you see that you hear the very, very small place inside which the image has been taken. And you see that it's a very, very noisy little place. The view where we see the globe is not itself global. It's a very small place from which we see the globe. And this is a difficulty always of this imagination of a globe. It loses the locality. We can now diminish the sound. And that's where we are, in fact. We are disoriented in space in a way which has absolutely nothing to do with the blue planet viewed from the moon by Apollo 8. This is a completely different story. We are disoriented in time and space by what geologists now call the Anthropocene. You know these images. You have seen many of those when you were at school learning geology. You know that when you are down there, it's older than when you are on the top, except if it has been shifted around and relayered. We know these images, and we are now, which is very strange, told by geologists that we are now in a history which resembles their history. And you learn at school, I'm sure, that the period of history, usually very long period, have a name, and that this name is the name of a geological force which has been the stronger at the time considered. The word, the disputed word, Anthropocene, which has been introduced by geologists, is to tell us, us the humanity people, social science, politicians, etc., that geologists would like to enroll us in their own definition of what has happened to the Earth. And they want to tell us that the human race, precisely a very strange agglomeration of people, collectively have become a geological force. And they say what is now no longer human history is now what they call geohistory. That is the history of the Earth as molded, so to speak, transformed, modified massively by the human generally. And of course, as you can imagine, many people are disputing this term, anthropos, because the anthropos of the Anthropocene is not clearly defined. It's not the responsibility of being the force of nature, a force equivalent to the force of nature, is completely implausible. I mean, if they put together the American, the Amazonian Indian, the people who use very little energy, the one who use a lot of energy, I mean, the word anthropos really doesn't mean much. And yet, what is interesting in this argument, and I think we should take it very seriously, much more seriously than people think when they dispute the term, is that it's a geological term. It's geologists who are telling us in the humanity or in the social sciences, look, if you take into account the ways history is being produced, the transformation of history, you have to accept that humans have a geological impact. And it's not an impact on the environment. We know that the humans have modified the environment for probably 100,000 years. It's not the modification of the environment by human, it's the modification of what they call the Earth system. So it's a modification in the way the Earth system itself has shifted to another equilibrium or disequilibrium. And that's what is so interesting in this disorientation in space and time that is specified by the word Anthropocene. And it's something which has to be taken very seriously, I think, because the political consequences, as I will show at the end of the lecture, I think are very important. But of course, there is something very implausible. And you understand why no one really accepts easily to be a geological force. I mean, individually, of course, it means nothing. But even as a general term, it's very implausible that any one of us could have an influence on these layers which take millions of years to accumulate. But it's not exactly where the Anthropocene group of scientists is pointing at. And it's very interesting to look for a minute to an article of Science magazine in January 2016. This article is important because it is a sort of sum, the best sum so far, of all the argument for and against the denomination Anthropocene in geology by geologists. And what you see here is a typical proof that are scrutinized by the scientists interested in this term. You see the glaciation on the bottom, and then you see, because of the atmosphere becoming hotter, suddenly a little layers there, which is the layer where suddenly lots of life is coming back after 10,000 or, in this case, 100,000 years. What is interesting here for the scientists who are describing this slide is not the size of the little layers. It will be minuscule anyway. It's the specificity, the originality, the chemical novelty of these little layers, which is what the thought experiment we have to imagine when we read this literature is that suppose that you show these layers in 10,000 years to a sedimentologist. The sedimentologist will very easily, they say today about the future, detect that there is something completely different from everything before in these little layers. There will be nucleotide, which are completely specific, pesticide, which didn't exist before, plastic, which did not exist before, soot, which did not exist before, and so on and so forth. So it's not, the notion of Anthropocene does not describe a very thick layers. It will be ridiculous. Whatever we do will appear on the ground as just a very, very thin pellicule, a very thin layer. But it's the specificity of these layers which is of interest for the scientist. And that's where they say there is a break. There is something which requires to understand completely differently what it is which has happened to the Earth. And so whatever is your definition of the Anthropocene, and there is a dispute on the date, there is a dispute on the way to make it a proof of the Anthropocene, it's extremely interesting because it pushes us very far away from only a space-based metaphor of the Earth. It basically, I think we can say, and that's what we try to do in these lectures and the lecture series, is something which is really a new scenography and a different way to look at how we will now have to consider how to be and to represent the Earth. And this is what I want to show you in the second part of these lectures. See, what we have to take into account is a composition of many different entities which are moving and which are not exactly what would be considered as part inside space. It's much more complicated than that. And it doesn't have to be immediately shaped and projected on what is called, and what we could call the cartographic globe, if you want. And that's where there is something really interesting here, which is the term that other scientists use, not this time the word Anthropocene, but the word critical zone. Now, you have to imagine, and this is the difficulty, the topographic difficulty which I want to share with you, that if you look there, what you see is actually a cork, a thin, we are not in a globe, we are on top of a skin, a very small layers of the Earth, layers which is, depending on the argument and the simulation, probably a few kilometers up and a few kilometers down, and everything, absolutely everything you have seen and encounter everywhere where life exists is just this little tiny little critical zone. And it's on these layers, so here you see simultaneously the layers there, which is the crust, so to speak, the thin layer, the skin, varnish really, it's very, very small. It's not everything on the Earth, it's not the center of the Earth, it's just a cork. And here you see a slice, so to speak. A slice made through these different layers, on top of which Alexandra and Sonia have projected the instrument with which we begin to gather the reaction of this little skin to its own activity. So, in a way, when we have this idea of a globe, we lose entirely the place where we actually live. It's a great paradox of the sciences that it's so difficult to represent the place where we live. And the word critical zone has many meanings. The word critical has, of course, a thermodynamic meaning. It means that it's out of equilibrium, that this very small layer is actually held by the living form themselves, if not on a planet. And this is, of course, the whole argument about the existence of Gaia. If we were on a different planet, on the moon, or on Mars, there would be none of this critical zone. They would not be. They would be in chemical equilibrium. That's the first meaning of critical. The other one, of course, is that it's critical in the sense that it's fragile. But it's critical also in the third sense that it's extremely difficult to know. And the great surprise, I think, we have when we consider and work with these scientists, and many of these images have actually been done with a group of scientists in Paris, trying exactly like us in the humanities or in the art to give a shape to their own work, is that the specificity, the amazing heterogeneity of this critical zone. Actually, this is the definition of a critical zone. It's completely heterogeneous. Centimeter by centimeters, meter by meter, animal by animal, living form by living form, process by process, it's different. And of course, it's very completely, if you are down there in the center of the Earth, it's much more homogeneous, or we know less, let's say. When we are on the top in the atmosphere, it's also much more homogeneous. But the quality, the difference of the critical zone, it's complete heterogeneity and the extreme difficulty to make sense of it. And that's why what you see here is a sort of imaginary landscape where we would have enough instrument to know as much about the critical zone as, how could I compare, as patient in a hospital would be, doctors in a hospital would know about their patient. We know, this is a great surprise, much more about inventing instruments to learn about the well-being of a patient in a hospital that we know about the sensitivity of these very, very thin layers on which we actually live. And there's no other way. I mean, we live everything we care for, everything we have ever encountered is really here in this very tiny critical zone. The ideal would really be, I mean, it's difficult to do that here because you see it. The ideal would be to see the critical zone completely sideways. That is to gather, to take it as a sort of skin. That is, you see, where we would be able to get not the Earth in space, which is always the difficulty of the notion of a globe, but the Earth seen as if you were in a parchment, on the surface of a parchment, where you will see all these little holes, all these little traces left by the activity of the animated beings. Because, of course, the whole critical zone is nothing but the activity of a living form. This is a sort of material or tapestry which represent the concrete existence of Gaia. And that's where, if you could actually look even further, zooming in on one of the aspect of this original tapestry, seeing it from very, very small. This is a very beautiful image produced by Sonia Levy using, which is a very nice new invention, photogrammetry. I mean, photogrammetry is old, but she managed to use it for very, very small element here, which is the mud, the grass, at the level of the grass, the dust, to give you a feeling for the sensitivity of the skin on which we are actually living, but which is so difficult to get and to represent when you imagine it in space. And that's where you see how beautiful it is, sort of thick. This is what it is to be inside. You are simultaneously flat, because it's just a piece of land, and then it has all the thickness and the profondeur. This is what we should be able to capture when we are interested in being inside and not seeing things from outside. And when we do this experiment with scientists, with artists, with social scientists like myself, we begin to propose and to invent what we call, maybe a bit maybe too exaggerated, a new cosmology. So what you are going to see is a new cosmology. Now, ladies and gentlemen, this is a scoop. It's never been shown before. This is a projection invented by Alexandra Arène after many discussions with scientists, which is trying to solve the problem I raised at the beginning, the problem of the globe. The globe is not a good representation because it's in space, because it's viewed from far away, because it doesn't extract the skin, and because, especially, it doesn't actually register the processes. And we are only on Earth because of the processes. So the idea is this. She decided that she will take the globe, she will flatten the globe, so that what you see in the four sides of a square is the center of the Earth. The Earth is not there, it's flattened, like you would do with a tart. You would spread it, so to speak. The center is now at the extremity, and in the middle is the atmosphere. This is, she says, where we actually live. We live in things which resemble more this than the globe. Why? Because if you are in the center, it means that the cycle that you see are the one which move the faster. When you move here, it's the one which has the slowest. So the difference is not a difference in space, which would say where you are in the cartographic imagination, longitude and latitude, and that's where you are, localization. Where you are in this representation is in between cycles which are slow or quick. The slowest one would be there, millions of years, 100 million years for the plate tectonics. The one here would be milliseconds, or day, or years. And the great interest of this way of representing the Earth is that finally we have something which foregrounds the notion of cycle, of transformation, and processes. Because the great peculiarity of the critical zone, the one which is most interesting for us, is that very little actually comes from the center of the Earth. The whole thing works in the critical zone because of a constant recycling in which all of the geochemistry and all of the animated elements are actually functioning. So instead of having us being trying to find our place in space, viewed from nowhere, we now begin to get a feeling for what it is to be situated inside what, probably there is no better word, is a vortex. We are inside a vortex. Being on Earth, being alive on Earth, is not being a little character in the infinite space on a globe. This is a very abstract idea of what it is to be on Earth. But to be located here as part of this vortex is probably a much more realistic way of understanding ourselves. Now, of course, you could ask, what is the main actor that is actually activating this vortex? And here we need to introduce, if the technology allows, one of the great moments in our little transformation of cosmology, namely the sun. Now, this is not a sort of Kabbalistic or mysterious or religious representation. It is actually, it's very funny because it's actually the best scientific representation of a puzzle for geochemists. Geochemists have been trying to figure out how can you simultaneously represent the geochemical activity of the Earth in the space. And when you have the old space, the question of geomorphology basically disappears. You just have the globe and you have the sun, and the whole question, we all learned that at school, is to decide if you are heliocentric or geocentric. Well, that doesn't solve any question for people in critical zone, because what they want to have is processes. So here you have, this is why I'm very proud of showing that for the first time here in Berlin, is simultaneously geocentric. It's a more geocentric representation. The Earth is actually here in the middle, and the vortex is turning, and simultaneously heliocentric. Exactly the thing you cannot do when you put the question of the Earth in space, where the whole question is to know if the Earth turns around or it's the sun. As you know, it makes rigorously no difference whatsoever for daily life, at least. It's a very important astronomer question, but it's not a question for us, and it's not a question for geochemists, certainly. Now, the great question, on the contrary, here for a geochemist is who is acting. Who is acting here are the two great forces which have been magnificently studied and interpreted by the argument of Gaia. The sun is the one that makes all these things turn, on the condition, of course, that the life forms which are on this very small pellicule of critical zone are using the sun to make something out of it. So, and that's in that sense where heliocentrism and geocentrism are shown simultaneously, thanks to Alexandra, in the same diagram, but it's not the same definition of what is a center. Because what counts here is the ability of the animated forms, all of the living forms which are able to use the sun, let's chlorophyll if you want, at the beginning, which have been able to turn the critical zone into a vortex. So it is geocentric. The only activity there is that of the life form. But it is also heliocentric, because the only source of energy which is coming, allowing all of this vortex to turn around, is actually the sun. So the whole idea is that it gives us a better definition of what life forms could be, in a way, an inner representation which will not be based on cartography or geography, but on what we call Gaia-graphy, which is almost the same thing, except the activity of a vortex is visible. And here is an attempt. It's a very complicated attempt. An attempt at mapping the trajectory of animated entities, all the animated entities which together compose the critical zone, but not by having them sort of dived into the same space, like in the cartographic ideal, but in making every one of them specific. So in this diagram, which has been built by Sonia Levy and Alexandra Arène after a long study into a little animal park in Ardennes, in the east of France, not very far from Germany, they tried to they tried to follow, to trace, and to find for each of the animated participants in the composition of Gaia a specific trajectory. And if the technique allow me, I will ask them to re-show the film now that I've given a sort of user's manual to read it and to see how it works. So that would be the movement of a park ranger. That then would be the wild boar moving around. The fox all the way up there on the left. The scientists studying forest animals also have to be documented. The marten somewhere there, yes, on the right. The GPS tracking of forest animal, which allows to trace them. You see also the owl now coming. The crows. Every one of those are composing the atmosphere, so to speak, of the Gaia. The water is soon. Look, this is the water. The water is an actor, like all the others. It's the river which crosses this little space. And then you have the hunter, because the hunter also are doing part in this space. The farmers, even the woodworms. Why wouldn't we not trace the woodworms? They play a role there. The badgers, the bats, the woodpeckers, the deer hunting dogs. All of those are simultaneously at work in this space. Now, of course, I agree, the space is a bit strange. It's not a Michelin map. You could not find your way in Belleval with this. But that's not the goal. The goal is not cartographic. The goal is processual, trying to find your place among the trajectory, which is differentiated trajectory of those entities, because they are, every one of them, building its own environment and building the critical zone. See, this is the difference. We are not in the critical zone. They build the critical zone. The critical zone has no other limit and no other duration and no other existence than the intertwined activity of all these various entities. I agree, it is strange. I mean, it doesn't look like a reasonable map of a piece of land. It has a sort of a, how should I say, aboriginous or autochthonous characters, as if it was, strangely enough, a sort of space that in which we are lost. But this is where now we have to find our place. And that's my third and last part, the political conclusion. Why is it important to try to represent with other visual imagination this question of the Earth? Why is it important to attempt with scientists and with artists and architects to represent differently the place where we are supposed to live? The reason, I think, is that it has a political and a very, I should say, very contemporary and very tragic consequence. Well, this is our attempt at producing a triangulation of a political position right now. It's interesting to see that in the trajectory, which I've called in many of my work modernization, we were supposed to move along this line here from this part, which could be called the local, and the one up there, which could be called the global, the ideal, the horizon of globalization, if you want. And what we have been calling the modernist project was to move from 1 to 2, that is, to extract ourselves from our own localization, so to speak. And really the imagination of a globe was the only way to do this extraction from the local. And we call globalization this movement. Well, as you all know, what has happened now is that globalization has become a bad name for many of us. And many of our citizens, many of our compatriots are now saying, wait, we are no longer trying to globalize. We think globalization is not only a myth, but it's also a trap. And what do? Well, they do something which is visible everywhere in France, in England with the Brexit, in America, of course, with Mr. Trump, visible also in Germany, as we saw in the last election, which is to say, if a globalization is no longer accessible, then let's go back. Let's go back to that one. The localization out of which you have extracted us in the name of modernization, and let us have our identity back. And this identity can be ethnically defined in a very narrow sense, or at least nationally defined. Let's get us back what could be called our gated community, so to speak. And of course, it makes a lot of sense if those people here believe, and maybe rightly so, that the ones who are actually going to the globalization have abandoned them. They also build their own gated community. Okay? So the tension which is visible everywhere, especially in Europe, but not only in Europe, that the globalization ideal is gone, and that we should go back to the land of all, so to speak, the old and protective identity, creates a tension, very important tension, traditional in left and right, but is forgetting the third attractor. And that's the one I want, and I've talked about so far. The third attractor is, of course, in a very different position vis-à-vis those two. The third attractor is here, but there's always a problem with projecting it here, is that no one sees it except if they are on the balcony. Now, of course, it makes a lot of sense that no one sees it because it's true. No one sees it. But it's a bit exaggerated. So if the technique can shift it there, it will be nice. Thank you. Well, that's the third one. Precisely the one I've been describing. The one we have been trying to describe through this alternative visualization. That's the one where it does not resemble the globe, even though by calling it critical zone, it captures many of the features of the globe. But it's not either a return to the land of all, which is here, even though it captures many of the elements, as I mentioned, heterogeneity, locality, attention to the detail of the land, and so on and so forth. So it's itself simultaneously an attractor, and in fact, if you look at many of the activist movement, many of the interests developed by, of course, the whole ecological movement, many of the argument against the notion of globalization, many of the argument about the critique of the return to an identity, everyone in some sort of way is trying to find a way to land there. how do we land on this place? Except it has very different characters from both the globe and the local, which have organized politics, and especially the difference between left and right, for at least a century. So the great paradox is that everyone seems to feel that there is a new attractors defined political position, allowing people to say, no, this is finished, this is reactionary, or this is progressive. But you don't know if it's progressive along this axis or along this axis. And this is where we have all a problem. And I decided not to put Mr. Trump into this. It's always useful to know where Mr. Trump is, because Mr. Trump would be somewhere there, all the way there, in a fourth position, which I didn't think was possible until Mr. Trump won the election, which is to say simultaneously to these people here, you will be protected, and to those people there, will make a lot of money, which is what it just did yesterday by proposing this new budget. So simultaneously, you can actually say, let's go back to the old America, and let's be completely globalized without any sort of regulation against the sort of abuse of capitalism. But Trumpism, if you can use this word, works on one condition: the denial of a climate change. And it's very, very interesting. This is why I think we should not celebrate Mr. Trump, it will be a bit exaggerated, but at least salute the first completely ecologically minded government, which is Trump government, which is obsessed by the climate question, but is obsessed negatively. And that's very useful, because it has done something no one has actually been able to do until him, to put the question of climate denial at the center of geopolitics. And that's why I think I like Mr. Trump in some sort of sense. It's just that if you imagine that there's a fourth position there, you take exactly the opposite of what he does, and you land exactly where we should. It's a great clarification. We are supposed to land there. We have to imagine positions which are a mix of things which would have defined the old locality, very different, and defined the whole definition of the world. In French we say mondialisation as well as globalization, but which are different in both cases. So this is where I think we are in something which is of great interest. This is why, in a way, be inside, not outside, not in the space, not seeing the earth from above, from nowhere, but being inside has political consequences. And it's very important that there is actually a joint interest and a joint, activity between scientists, artists, and activists. Because the most important thing is to land there, even though it's very, very difficult to define it. And I agree, being there, you could feel that it's a bit cramped. Maybe you feel a bit claustrophobic about it. And there is something, to be inside it is something claustrophobic. I mean, I agree. It's sort of inside. It's not that you are deep inside in a cave. It's that you are not allowed to get outside. You are entangled in this vortex. See, it's a positive definition of being inside. It's not you are prisoners like Plato imagined in this very strange and funny imagination. It's that you are actually always inside this vortex without way to escape, this is true, but also with all of the others who are sort of breeding and brewing with you. So this is one of the diagrams that Alexandra has proposed before the one I showed. And it has a sort of how should I say, a slightly childish aspect, if you want, but at least the experimental spirit of what we do, and that I hope I have conveyed to you, is visible. It also looks a bit like the treasure map that we read into old stories. It has a bit of a character of something in the 16th century, something at the very beginning when we started to discover a new land. So this is why we should not be pessimistic about the situation. We are not actually, of course, it's tragic. It's a tragic situation. But it's also the moment where we discover new land. Just at the time, simultaneously at the time of the old, what was called before the great discoveries. It's not a discoveries in extension, it's a discovery in intensity, a discovery of a new way of being in the old land, but understood differently. And so in a way, all of this new situation resemble a renaissance, if you want. Thank you very much.